my name is Jayon Woka, and welcome to the History of the Blood War series. In this episode, I'm going to give you a brief timeline of the Blood War between devils and demons. As one of the defining conflicts throughout the planes, and one that goes on to this day, the Blood War is key information you'll need to know about on your planar adventures. If you've never heard of the Blood War before, a brief rundown of what it's about can be found in Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes for 5th edition D&D, the Manual of the Planes for both 3rd and 4th editions, and several books from the 2nd edition, especially those dealing with Planescape, such as Guide to Hell or Hellbound: The Blood War. Checking on YouTube or Google will also get you decent results. And of course, if you have an hour and a half to kill, I do have a long ramble. That's the first episode in this series, and that lays out a lot of what this series is going to try and get at. Right now, what I want to do is give the best unified timeline of the Blood War up to this point that I can. By best, what I mean is the version that has the least contradictions and the most agreement among the sources. And by up to this point, I mean that we're talking about, in the Forgotten Realms, roughly 1491 Dale Reckoning. And I don't know exactly how that will match up if you're more familiar with Gray Space or Kryn Space or any other sphere. But I think a lot of people are familiar with the Forgotten Realms, so I hope that will be sufficient for you. And that's pretty much what I'm going to be using from this point forward. One thing that I do want everybody to keep in mind, though, even though I will be using Dale Reckoning for those dates that we can place, a lot of these events happened long before recorded history, or they happened in places where time acts differently. So what's important for this timeline is the sequence and sort of the importance of the events, not the specific dates. So briefly, I want to return to the idea of contradictions again, because trying to decide what was most likely true was actually the biggest part of putting this talk together. The events in this telling come from a variety of sources that I may value one way while you value them another. Not only that, we're discussing transcendental beings and reality-shaping actions. Depending on your perspective, certain events may have happened another way or may not have happened at all. Still, I think this will be useful to those who are interacting with the Fiends, as most realities will share some aspects of the Blood War. So with all that being said, I present you with a timeline of the Blood War. We begin with the ancient history of this eternal conflict, which began with the creation of the multiverse. There are more differing accounts of this first creation than I can really count, but what's important about this is that the planes were created in this first creation, as were the 4 principles: purity and corruption, order and chaos. And usually you'll see this in a good, evil, law, and chaos formulation. In that first episode that I mentioned earlier, I get into more of why I'm using this particular formulation. So to get back into the story, in this beginning of times, purity's force drew against corruption, and order struggled with chaos. And as beings emerged, whether from this conflict or just on their own, they flew into primal conflicts, which I will call the Wars of Alignment. Now, these Wars of Alignment were fought in many ways, but there are 5 major conflicts that I've, found sort of written material about, and that also fit into this group of Wars of Alignment. And those conflicts are the Dawn War, which was fought between gods and primordials over realm space; the All Dragons and All Saints War, fought over Kryn space; the battle between Cerberus and Kyber over Eberron space; the Blood War between devils and demons; and the multiplanar War of Law and Chaos. None of these conflicts has a known start date, but all of them began in this time before the structure of the multiverse as we know it took hold. The War of Law and Chaos was the first of these to end. Many sources refer to the wars plural of Law and Chaos, and that this one, the conflict between the Wind Dukes of Akka and the Queen of Chaos, was only the greatest of these wars. But since no other conflict is ever named as part of these Wars of Law and Chaos, I feel comfortable just using the name for this particular conflict, Wind Dukes versus the Queen of Chaos, and Miska the Wolf Spider. Anyway, I'm not going to dive too deep here, but I will just say that the Wind Dukes prevailed over the Queen of Chaos and Miska at the Battle of Pesh, and they won the war. If you want to know more about this battle, you should look up information about the Rod of Seven Parts and specifically the lore behind it, because the Rod of Seven Parts was created due to the climax of this battle. So check out info on that artifact if you want to know more about this conflict. An unspecified time later, perhaps weeks, perhaps eons, we have the fall of Asmodeus. Once aligned with the Celestials, Asmodeus suddenly slew his divine master and fell from grace, becoming imprisoned on the plane of Beator, now known as the Nine Hells. This is the essence of most tales of Asmodeus' origin as Lord of the Ninth and Master of all Devils. Some stories also claim that the origin of Asmodeus' powerful artifact, known as the Ruby Rod, was made from a piece of the Shard of Evil, which was at the heart of the Abyss. Histories that blame Asmodeus for starting the Blood War point to this act as the trigger, but I feel that this is less likely because the end of the primal battles between Order and Chaos, usually equated with the Battle of Pesh, is usually implied to be before Asmodeus' fall. Plus, the nature of Asmodeus' fall is usually tied to the already ongoing Blood War, so it couldn't have started it. But I will definitely be discussing a lot of the murkiness of the origins of Asmodeus in a future episode. So definitely hit that subscribe button and come back later to check that out. Now, following the fall of Asmodeus, the Lords of the Nine and the Princes of the Abyss were acknowledged. Because Asmodeus is usually understood to be the first and only Lord of the Ninth, this arrival of the Lords of the Nine must have come after his fall. The Lords ruled the devils and the princes ruled the demons. That's the sort of basic distinction. But the titles have shifted somewhat over time, and it seems like these days you'll usually see the highest devils called archdevils or dukes of hell, and the highest demons will be called abyssal lords. But on this channel and in this episode, I'm going to stick to calling I'm going to stick to calling devils lords and demons princes. So just so we can sort of keep some consistency. The next major event in the history of the Blood War was actually the end of another war of alignment, the Dawn War. Roughly 35,000 years before Dale Reckoning, the primordial Ubteo betrayed the other primordials, allowing the gods to triumph in the war. Now, directly, this didn't affect the Blood War much, but it likely provided for the next event, the intervention of the Celestials. A vast army of Celestials, Archons, Cardinals, and other warriors devoted to purity invaded the lower planes in a bid to destroy both the devils and the demons. My source for this claims that this intervention was a response to the Blood War spilling onto the celestial planes, but as the fiends of the time had the ability to move across planes, this wouldn't have been new. I think it's probable that many angels had been involved in the Dawn War, and were able to turn their attention to the lower planes once that was over. The three forces, Celestials, Devils, and Demons, each fought against the other two for a full year. Then, abruptly, both the Devils and the Demons turned all their forces against the Celestials. In a week, the Celestials were driven out of the lower planes, their army of many millions whittled down to, at a maximum, 3,000 beings. Now, it's important to keep in mind that there was no formal agreement or alliance between the Devils and Demons. Right after this victory, in fact, they returned to fighting each other. However, this experience did convince most powers and adherents of purity that they would never win against the combined infernal forces. It was the beginning of the philosophy called the balance, basically managing the Blood War so such an alliance would never come about and one side would not prevail. Now, this act marks the end of what I would call the early period of the Blood War. Demons and devils had been fighting throughout this early period from creation until this point, but few specific events inside the lower planes are well known. Now we move on to the Great Blood War period, where most of the action of the Blood War proper take place. The first act of the Great War period is a perfect display of the Blood War's new top position in interplanar politics. Following the intervention, some deific powers continued to meddle in the Blood War, but now on one side or the other, aiding the devils or the demons rather than opposing both. One particular power, whose name has not survived, threw in heavily with the demons. In response, the devils systematically slaughtered all of that being's worshippers, making the being totally insignificant at a single stroke. This act confirmed that not even great powers should attempt to control the fiends. Even those powers who live in the lower planes rarely have fiends of any kind as servants. After this, and largely unconnected, came the formation of what is effectively a military general staff for all devilry. This group, originally called the Dark Nine, was created and led by the pit fiend called Cantrum. Sometime after its formation, Cantrum was assassinated by an unknown being. Rather than raise a new leader, the others simply continued on as the more familiar Dark Eight. By this time, great battles were being fought regularly throughout the lower planes. One of the greatest victories for the devils in the entire Blood War is the complex deception known as the Four-Cross, which ended in a crushing defeat for the demon hordes. The pit fiend Bel, who devised and executed this treachery, vaulted up near the top of the devil hierarchy, a step below the Dark Eight and with many legions under his command. Most likely, sometime after Bel's elevation came the first of a myriad battles on the legendary Field of Nettles. This well-trod site is on Othris, first layer of Carceri. It's an island surrounded on all sides by the river Styx. Now, I didn't find any sure record of who won the first battle, but there have been so many battles there that it hardly matters. I placed the Rebellion of the Inferiors, which is a major act, in this general period, though it's difficult to know exactly if it came before the fighting at the Field of Nettles or if it came after. Either way, this event was far more important for the devils, and likely the demons as well. What the rebellion consisted of was basically a mutiny. Without much warning, disaffected lesser devils did the unthinkable and revolted against their superiors. As this happened, a group of Balors, which are a kind of powerful demon, arrived to aid the inferiors, only for the inferiors to turn on and destroy the Balors. The Dark Eight then suppressed the revolt and re-established the Infernal Order. This is the one and only recorded instance of lesser devils mutinying en masse. Most sources, and nearly all devils, seem to agree that this rebellion was ultimately the result of a demonic plot. Sometime after the rebellion came a momentous summit at Goresh Chasm. Leaders of the devils and the demons came together to negotiate a peace between the two sides. A brawl erupted between the pit fiends and the Balors, escalating into a general battle and ruining any thoughts of truce in the lower planes from that time forward. Another important battle in this period was the First Battle of Moldris's Gap, named for the leader of the victorious side, the pit fiend Moldris. This stretch of land on the shores of the river Styx was valuable for ferrying troops to other contested areas. And this battle showed how important controlling the river Styx was to both sides. And like the Field of Nettles, more and more battles continued on that field until now. They're probably fighting on there right this second. Some demon princes would come to an association with the interplanar worshippers of entropy, the Doom Guard. Working together, they created powerful artifacts known as the Ships of Chaos, which are especially lethal to beings drawn to the principle of order. However, fighting among the princes to decide the ownership of these ships has meant that they have not yet been used. One of the most important events in the history of the Blood War is also one of the least known, and this event is the Great Escapade of the Maelder. The Melder's full name is the Meldur et Kvurik, and that the spelling of that should be showing on the screen now. And the Meldur was a behemoth creature which was said to be linked to the fiend's ability to teleport. The Meldur was originally kept by the Yugoloths, but a group of Batizu managed to kidnap it. The Yugoloths attempted to manipulate a band of adventurers into recovering the Meldur for them, but in the process, the Meldur was dropped into the river Styx. Most scholars think that this was actually the reason that fiends can no longer teleport across the plains. Now at this point, with the loss of such an important ability for the fiends, I mark the end of the Great Blood War period. After this, every event should be considered recent, even if it happened centuries ago by mortal reckoning. Though we will soon come to a few concrete dates, it's very difficult to date anything in the Great Blood War era definitely. Similarly, the next event may have happened anywhere between 200 and 20,000 years ago. This event is known as the Reckoning of Hell, and it established the order of devilry that most scholars of the Infernal are familiar with today. Two of the greatest devil lords, Mephistopheles and Baalzebul, coveted Asmodeus' position and schemed to unseat him. Each saw the other as their main obstacle to power, so they raised alliances of the other lords. Mephistopheles was joined by Dispater, Mammon, and Geryon, while Baalzebul allied with Moloch, Belial, and Zariel. The two alliances mustered many mighty legions and lined up for battle. Just before it began, Geryon revealed his true colors, turning all the pit fiends against the lords in the name of Asmodeus. Rather than being unseated, Asmodeus had actually strengthened his position. After humbling them in this way, Asmodeus returned the lords back to their posts, but three got more punishment. Belial was deposed and replaced by his daughter Glacia. Zariel was deposed and imprisoned, replaced by Bel of the Four-Cross. And Baalzebul, while retaining his lordship, was forced into the shape of a gigantic, unutterably disgusting slug. Some sources say that Asmodeus created the Dark Eight at this point, not earlier, but most other sources imply that the Dark Eight have been in power longer than even old and powerful demons remember, which would put it before the Reckoning, since the Reckoning is cited as the first event of the modern era, as it were. The next paradigm-shifting event in the Blood War afflicted the demons. This was the death of Orcus, demon prince of undeath, at the hands of the valiant drow deity Kiaransali. This took place in 1359 DR, or shortly thereafter, at the same time that Orcus's powerful wand was stolen by a mortal in realm space. Orcus had been very active in the Blood War with his huge mobs of undead, so this dealt a heavy blow to the demonic side. Though Orcus would be resurrected in a relatively short period, his power was reduced from a level equal to divinities to a state which, while still vastly more powerful than most beings, was a shadow of his former presence. 30-some years later, realm space would become afflicted with the Spell Plague, sometimes called the Blue Breath of Change. The Spell Plague caused what were known as the Outer Planes, including the Lower Planes, to become part of the Astral Sea, while the Inner Planes joined to become the Elemental Chaos. As this momentous shift occurred, Asmodeus somehow flung the Abyss into the Elemental Chaos, bringing the river Styx fully onto his plane of Baator. Without this to connect the two planes, the Blood War cooled off considerably, though the hostility itself never faded. Those who have studied the Spell Plague know that in realities based around the world axis, that is, the Astral Sea and the Elemental Chaos cosmology, will remember that the Abyss was created in the Elemental Chaos by a seed of utmost evil, the same one, in fact, that Asmodeus took part of to make his mythical ruby rod, which would seem to make it impossible for Asmodeus to have done this. However, as these details both come from sources with similar origins, I can only mark this as a result of changing realities, and we may never reconcile such paradoxes. The Second Sundering, roughly 100 years after the Spell Plague, seems to have shifted the reality of realm space back to a Great Wheel cosmology. This does seem to have led to some renewal of combat due to the restoration quote-unquote of the River Styx. The most recent event in the Blood War that we know definitely is the demotion of Bel. Since the Reckoning, Bel had been Lord of Avernus, the first layer of the Nine Hells. Armies of demons had now invaded Avernus, and Bel proved unable to remove them. In response, Asmodeus demoted Bel back to commander and re-elevated Zariel. As of this time, however, Zariel has not had much more success. Now, of course, I haven't listed every single rise and fall here, as that would be impossible, and we haven't even got every detail of the things that I did cover, but this was just a brief, rough and ready timeline of the Blood War that'll be useful for anybody who will be exploring the planes. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode, and if you did, it'd be great if you would hit that thumbs up button. If I brought up something that you want to hear more about, or if you have more suggested reading for me, or just things I should look into, please let me know about them in the comments. I hope to meet you guys again here soon for some more diving into the deep lore of the Blood War. Thanks.